We are going to try to get this posted to the Missouri Folklore Society YouTube channel for people to digest later. So everyone is aware that we are recording. I'm going to share my screen if I can get to document 13. No, we're not going on that. Okay. Here it is. We are here to welcome Nathaniel Williams. To my utter amazement, Nathaniel reminds me that he graduated with his BA from Truman in English in 1993, and he completed his master's thesis under my direction in 1995, which is 27 years ago. Mm-hmm. He is a ranking Twain scholar, but he is also a very gifted writer of short fiction, and has authored the book Gears and God, Technocratic Fiction, Faith and Empire in Mark Twain's America, very well received from University of Alabama Press, and has multiple articles in American literature, utopian studies, and elsewhere. He's a specialist in science fiction, and he's on the Gunn Center for the Study of Science Fiction's Advisory Board at the University of Kansas, which is where he took his PhD in 2010. And he is associate professor of English at the University of California, Davis. Tonight's presentation, Mark Twain and American Science Fiction's Legacy, 1870 to 1910, goes into a really unexplored area of Mark Twain's influence and legacy in science fiction. Dr. Williams writes, Mark Twain's career coincided with a burgeoning dime novel industry that published hundreds of books about boy inventors, steam-driven robots, submarines, and airships. Twain's stories often mirrored these science fiction works, even as he viewed the genre skeptically. Ultimately, Twain's love-hate relationship with technology, you may have seen the famous photograph of him in Tesla's laboratory, shaped his late life anti-imperialism as he opposed America's use of technology to violently assert its dominance around the globe. This presentation uncovers some of the writers, including Twain's brother from Keokuk, who used science fiction to grapple with their changing world, and shows how Twain repurposed their ideas to his own ends. This integrates very, very well with something we're doing currently in the Missouri Folklore Society. The next meeting will be in Hannibal, where there's a great steampunk colony, and they are planning to have a big presence at our November meeting. I'll be talking with the folklore group more about the Folklore Society in the November meeting later. But with that, we welcome back our alum, our colleague, and my good old friend, Dr. Nathaniel Williams.
Oh, thank you, Adam. I appreciate that. Thank you also for giving the entire title of the book, which I think is always helpful because academic book titles are always a bit long. And I think when you look at things through that lens of a single genre, right, just like science fiction, it helps you notice all the different areas where one particular type of fiction touches our culture. And it's always many different places, and that's why we get technocratic fiction, faith, and empire in Mark Twain's America, even though Mr. Twain, Sam Clemens, is only really the focus of one chapter of the book. But I want to talk about him to start this off. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and it says participants can now see my application. That's always a good message. Yes. All right. So when scholars discuss Mark Twain's novel-length science fiction, the most significant works are A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court from 1889 and Tom Sawyer Abroad from 1894. And I should say that Connecticut Yankee has traditionally been viewed as one of his better works. Tom Sawyer Abroad has traditionally been viewed as one of his lesser works. Now, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court is obviously a time travel novel. So in that way, it fits the bill. True Hank Morgan, the book's protagonist, does not build a machine to reach his remote destination. He's actually hit on the head with a crowbar by an angry subordinate at the Hartford Colt Arms Factory, and he travels through space and time to Arthurian times. But throughout the book, Hank succeeds because he uses his mechanical skills to recreate 19th century technology in 6th century England. Dan Beard's illustrations show the characters change from helplessly hiding in a tree from a knight when he first encounters one to becoming the boss of Camelot, greater than the king, and even sallying forth in armor as Ye Iron Dude. And I'll come back to that guy later. Tom Sawyer Abroad from 1894 is more about geographical travel. It's about rapid transit across the globe, and it's set in the recent past of antebellum America, mostly so that Twain could incorporate his already famous characters. In it, Tom, Huck Finn, and their friend, the former slave Jim, become stowaways in a fantastic winged aerial vehicle, a balloon that is prematurely launched on its maiden voyage. And the same artist, Dan Beard, drew this canopy here. The bat-like wings of the balloon are shown, although the higher portion of the frame. While it's never elaborately described by Twain, the inventor who created it promises that the airship is an innovation that will astound the world. After the craft's inventor disappears overboard, Tom Sawyer takes charge and somewhat inadvertently guides the ship across the Atlantic, into Egypt and through the Middle East. In both novels, we find a commingling of two American obsessions: exploration of faraway places and the adoration of new technology. Stories about those things were all over the US during this same time. In fact, Tom Sawyer wasn't the first fictional boy to pilot an airship across the globe while accompanied by an older African-American man and a boisterous friend with an Irish surname. That honor goes to Frank Reed Jr., whose dime novel exploits sent him traveling in submarines and airships with his partners, the Irishman Barney O'Shea and African-American Pomp. By 1894, the year that Tom Sawyer Abroad was published, over 50 tales featuring Frank, Pomp, and Barney had been released, many in a weekly series called the Frank Reed Library. And Reed Jr. was only the tip of the boy inventor iceberg. In the 1890s, there were at least 4 series featuring recurring inventor heroes who built fanciful modes of transportation. The sheer number of these texts, over 300 published in under 10 years, suggests that Americans were drawn to this material. So tonight, what I want to talk about is Twain's place in the larger spectrum of 1880s and 1890s inventor fiction and examine some of the overlapping ideas we find there. First, I'll introduce these dime novel series and then discuss some of the unique and maybe not so unique ways that Mark Twain changed that genre. And then finally, I'll look at Twain's private thoughts about the most famous science fiction writer of his time, Jules Verne, which interestingly gives us some insights on another American science fiction writer, Twain's own brother, Orion Clemens. Looking at Twain, Verne, and these dime novels gives us a better sense of how much Mark Twain had his finger on the pulse of late 19th century America, but also shows us he wasn't the only US writer to take the approach that he did. Now, boy inventor dime novels appeared in weekly publications with names like the Boys Star Library, Happy Days, and the New York 5-Cent Library. They were printed on cheap paper and treated as disposable reading material for young men. So in that, they bear a real kinship to the Penny Dreadfuls that were out at the same time in Britain, and of course, the later 20th century American comic book in that respect. The first science fiction dime novel is Edward Sylvester Ellis's The Steam Man of the Prairies from 1868. In it, the invention is a steam-driven automaton shaped like a giant man with a boiler in his stomach and a smokestack that comes out of his stovepipe top hat. The protagonist's name is Johnny Brainerd, a 15-year-old disabled genius from St. Louis, Missouri, who uses his invention to travel out west, find gold, fight native peoples, and return a hero. We're told his mechanical ingenuity bordered on the marvelous, but he's also described as, quote, small and misshapen, a humpbacked dwarf. And he's also a charmer. People immediately like him when they meet him. So essentially, Johnny Brainerd is portrayed as kind of spiritually and intellectually, but not physically, prepared for life on the frontier. It's the steam man that gives him mobility and power. As such, Ellis's novel encompasses the post-Civil War United States anxieties regarding expansion, disability, technology, civil rights, and capital acquisition. Chapters feature Johnny Brainerd hunting buffalo, confronting and killing a grizzly bear, and other typical Western dime novel adventures. From its first appearance, it seems the steam man's value comes as much from its ability to terrorize the native population as it does from its ability to traverse wide swaths of land. At the novel's end, the heroes find their canyon encampment blocked by a group of completely stock character Indian villains. With regret, Brainerd fires up the steam man's boiler into full power and sends him rushing into the barricade, where he explodes, resulting in his opponent's mass murder. Brainerd saves the day for his white comrades, and he uses the gold to pay for an expensive formal education, which concludes the text in kind of a rags to riches manner. So what we have early on in this genre really are multiple established tales being used here. One is the cowboy Western, one is the rags to riches melodrama, and then we've got this additional component of the inventor. Now, dime novels were frequently reprinted or serialized in one magazine and then printed in full in another, sometimes even with a different title, so that the publishers could make old stories look new and maybe sell a kid the same story twice. In 1876, a rival publisher, Toosie Press, saw a reprint of The Steam Man of the Prairies and had one of their staff writers, Harry Inton, write an imitation called Frank Reed and His Steam Man of the Plains. This story introduces 16-year-old Reed, a New Yorker, who builds his steam man and takes him to Missouri, where he and his cousin fight natives, chase buffalo, and find gold. It has been called a near plagiarism of Ellis's novel. Unlike Johnny Brainerd, however, Reed has no physical disability to overcome. His heroics could be transplanted into any cowboy dime novel. This is an unauspicious start, but over the decades, Toosie publishers developed an entire series around Frank Reed's son, Frank Reed Jr., with over 190 Reed tales published. On September 24th, 1892, the Reed series blazed a trail when Toosie released the Frank Reed Library, a weekly dime novel that was devoted exclusively to the boy inventor's exploits, with each issue offering one approximately 40,000 word story in its entirety. Science fiction historian Sam Moskowitz notes that this made it the first regularly published, exclusively science fiction periodical. Between 1890 and 1890, the series introduces a new power source, electricity, and features all sorts of vehicles, including airships, submarines, bicycles, tricycles, electric buckboards, and other oddities. If you can't tell, there's a formula to this. Each adventure highlights a single invented device, no longer reliant on steam, and now possessing crafts that can traverse sea and air. Frank Reed's adventures gradually expand beyond the Wild West and into every corner of the globe. To give you a taste of that, here are a couple of the most famous titles from those. One was From Pole to Pole, or Frank Reed Jr.'s Strange Submarine Voyage, or Frank Reed Jr. and His Electric Air Yacht, or The Great Inventor Among the Aztecs. The Reed stories their success inspired the publisher to now create a second boy inventor hero, Jack Wright, whose exploits were serialized in 121 separate stories. There is some debate among historians over which of these two characters was the most popular, Reed or Wright. In 1894, Toosie's Happy Days featured a race between the two, which, as modern comic book fans would call this, a crossover issue, right? Special guest appearance by. It was called Jack Wright and Frank Reed, the Two Young Inventors, or Brains Against Brains. And in the story, Jack Wright wins, but only because Frank Reed had to stop and help somebody along the way. I should mention one other landmark, the story's author. The publisher attributed every single issue to the pseudonym No Name, and you can kind of see that up here. But most of the 300 plus stories attributed to that name were actually written by Lou Senares, the son of a Cuban American, or I'm sorry, the Brooklyn-born son of a Cuban tobacco merchant who supported his family after his father died by writing for a living. He is almost certainly the most prolific Cuban American writer of the 19th century and maybe ever. His status as a first-generation immigrant complicates some of these stories that he wrote. And I could say a little more about that during question and answer period. And in the 20th century, he was posthumously dubbed the American Jules Verne by Hugo Gernsback, the editor of Amazing Stories. Street and Smith, a rival dime novel publisher, developed a series in their Nugget library featuring a young inventor named Tom Edison Jr. 11 stories appeared between 1891 and 1892 during the zenith of the boy inventor craze. The titular hero's father is an inventor, although the story makes it clear he's not the real Thomas Alva Edison. However, the character's name is meant to be a draw, and if that weren't enough, the stories are attributed to a pseudonym. I don't know if you can read it down here. The pseudonym was Philip Reed, spelled exactly like Frank Reed, the explorer. So that implies a tie to Toozy's Boy Inventor. And again, the young people who were buying these might not have even realized that these were two different publishers competing for their dollars. In the example I have here, Tom Edison Jr.'s Electric Sea Spider, it features an aluminum craft that propels itself along the sea's surface on its legs, similar to a water bug. Not soon after Tom Edison Jr.'s final story appeared, Street and Smith debuted a new boy inventor named Electric Bob, whose adventures were so idiosyncratic that many scholars read them as parodies. Most of Bob's vehicle weapons are giant motorized animals. For example, his 30-foot-tall electric ostrich has a gizzard containing an enlarged revolver cylinder holding 25 Winchester cartridges. The ostrich also serves as a camera with a telescopic neck and a lens in its mouth. Dime novel scholars tend to agree that these over-the-top constructions are tongue-in-cheek. Street and Smith's willingness to call attention to the outright absurdity of boy inventor novels is, of course, a backhanded compliment to the genre. So where does Twain fit into all this? Well, here I have the Connecticut Yankee and Tom Sawyer Abroad. The Steam Man of the Prairies is published in 1868, and then 1876, which is the same year that The Adventures of Tom Sawyer is published, the first Frank Reed story is serialized. There are 19 more Reed stories published in the 10 years that follow, and Tom Edison Jr. and Jack Wright begin in 1891. So we see a lot of this is going on in that period between A Connecticut Yankee and Tom Sawyer Abroad. We have that beginning of the weekly publication in 1892, and then just kind of for context, the waning of the boy inventor dime novel happens in 1910, mostly because publishing changes. Publishers realize they can do better and make more money and get a bigger audience if they sell hardback books. And all they do is take the boy inventor trope and create a new character, Tom Swift, and sell him as the inventor boy hero of a hardback series. So that's kind of the end of this era in 1910. It's also the end of Mark Twain. He passes away early that year. Now, the science fiction scholar John Clute has dubbed all of these 19th century works Edisonades, evoking the spirit of inventor Thomas Alva Edison, who came to prominence during roughly the same time frame. Clute's definition of an Edisonade is this: any story which features a young U.S. male inventor hero who uses his ingenuity to extricate himself from tight spots. The invention by which he accomplishes this feat is not, however, simply a weapon, though it will almost certainly prove to be invincible against any foe and may make the hero's fortune. It is also a means of transportation, for the Edisonade is not only about saving the country or planet through personal spunk and native wit. It is also about lighting out for the territory. So when defining these in the 1990s, Clute borrows one of Twain's most famous literary phrases, which is Huck Finn's penultimate line from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, where he expresses a need to, quote, light out for the territory. And I think all the authors of these, including Twain, understood that many young people in America felt that way. In the standard dime novel variant, the invention, be it aircraft, Land Rover, submarine, or other, offers protection from violent attack and serves as a staging ground for other advanced weapons, such as bombs or machine guns, that often far exceed the armaments of the traveling protagonist's enemies. Clute notes that Edisonaids, quote, basic story has been an essential shaper of US realpolitik for more than a century. So it's part of an ongoing broader concept of American identity that blends rugged individualism and technophilia to justify expansion of power and influence around the globe. What we find in these is the repeated idea of technocracy. And in my book, I define that as the point of view where the right to lead and the ability to create and use advanced technology are roughly analogous and are mutually reinforcing. So when I talk about technocracy, that's the concept I'm really dealing with. Also in the book, I use a map to kind of show how readers of the Frank Reed novels might conceive of technology and the spread of US influence. The dotted areas on these two maps are the places that Frank Reed visited over the course of his stories. In the first 10 years, we see most of the action was happening in the American West. There was one polar adventure, there was one adventure down the Nile and into Southern Africa. But by 1994 alone, Frank Reed is appearing in more countries than not. And again, remember that the author of most of these stories was a Cuban American. And in my book, I spend a lot of times discussing his views on Cuba's war for independence against Spain during the 4 years before the US got involved. That's an interesting story we don't really have time for now, but note that Reed Jr.'s readers followed him around half the globe for 20 years. By the time of the Spanish-American War, which is the moment when America really tries to become a global imperial power, an entire generation had grown up on this technocratic expansionist fiction. Twain's connection to the Edisonaids is deep, although we don't have hard evidence that he read any of them. Certainly the Iron Dude drawing from Connecticut Yankee bears some resemblance to Lucinaren's first Frank Reed adventure from several years earlier, where the inventor dons bulletproof chainmail armor while firing his 6-shooter at bootleggers from his electric boat on Lake Michigan. The connections also contain overlapping characterizations. For Twain aficionados, perhaps the most significant member of the Reed stories is Pomp, the African-American sidekick. Even in the earliest stories, Pomp is simultaneously portrayed as a hero and a buffoon. Still, in the first 3 Frank Reed stories, Pomp shoots and kills no fewer than 4 white men, always to the approval of his companions. An example of this odd contrast comes in Frank Reed Jr. and his Steam Wonder from 1882. We're told that Pomp wins a barrel of whiskey in a headbutting contest and becomes embarrassingly drunk. The scene is full of stock racial humor. Then, however, Pomp sells the barrel and gives the proceeds to 2 girls Frank Reed Jr. has rescued from Indian captivity. And the narrator says, Pomp was recognized as a white man after. Now, what's important here is this is published 2 years before the famous scene in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, where Huck has a realization that the escaped slave Jim is, quote, white inside because of his unselfish behavior. And the line is delivered as if that's the highest compliment a white kid could give a black adult at that time. But it is true that generations of Americanists have seen this as one of the great moments of sympathy in American literature, where Huck is overcoming his racist upbringing to see his connection to Jim. And one of the most common frustrations of readers of Huck Finn is the author's approach of making Jim noble and intelligent in some scenes, while apparently poking fun at him in others. So what we find in Frank Reed Jr. tales is proof that Mark Twain wasn't the only 19th century author trying to craft an African-American character who was sympathetic, but with problematic results. Now, Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court is Mark Twain's first real contribution to the Edisonaids. The protagonist and narrator, Hank Morgan, embodies the confident, technologically savvy, and imperialistically minded hero of the Edisonaids as he attempts to shape 6th century England into his own preferred image. Comparing Twain's work with dime novels, however, is somewhat inexact. Dime novel authors like Lucinaren's worked hurriedly, generating thousands of words in days. to make regular monthly and weekly publications. Twain spent over 5 years, the better portion of the late 1880s, working on and off at writing A Connecticut Yankee. Similarly, the dime novel's narrative canvas was necessarily episodic, presenting adventures in installments with little consistent long-term character development. Twain's longer first-person narrative allows frequent moments of interior reflection by the protagonist, including incidents where he elaborates on the broader cultural ideas that inform his grand schemes. I'll give you an example. Many of you may recall the end of A Connecticut Yankee, in which Hank Morgan and his young proteges fight 30,000 assembled knights in a final battle to decide if England will be a democracy or a feudal monarchy. Morgan uses minefields and a Gatling gun to defend his group, but the most horrifying method may be the wire he runs around his encampment and then fills with an electric current. Morgan tells how one knight touches the wire and fills the area with the smell of burning flesh. Poor fellow, Hank says, dead as a doornail and never knew what hurt him. Morgan's electric fence is so successful it creates a problem. Their camp is enclosed in a solid wall of the dead. The scene has been read as an eerie forecasting of World War I's trench warfare, and I still occasionally hear someone call it the first portrayal of electrocution in US literature. Not so. In Frank Reed and his adventures with his latest invention, Reed travels an enormous electric tricycle encased with a bulletproof mesh cage for protection. When attacked by another indigenous group, Reed runs an electric current through the wire cage around the tricycle. I'm quoting now. The 6 savages who laid hands on the tricycle were killed instantly. They dropped to the ground in their tracks and remained as motionless as only the dead can. So despite the racial overtones here, this is a mass electrocution that predates Twain's use of the concept in Connecticut Yankee by 6 years. And it's not just the violent use of advanced military technology that defines these characters. It's their approach to technology. For example, in Frank Reed Jr. and his airship from 1884, Reed Jr. invents a heavier than aircraft and embarks on a voyage. He discovers an ancient sunken city that has an intact silver mine underneath a lake in a remote Mexican mountain range. Searching for information, he lands his airship in a Mexican village where the craft frightens everyone until Frank spots a priest and has Barney make the sign of the cross. To get answers, he implies that he's some kind of ghostly or angelic visitor. Come here, Father, and answer my questions as you value your soul. Frank gets the information he needs and returns to the ship. As they rise to the air, he describes these events to Barney and Pomp. That old fellow thinks he's been talking to one of the people from the sunken city, said Frank, and he always will tell people so. They will hereafter regard him as a wonderful man. It may be that he will tell them a cock and bull story about visitors from heaven and what they said to him. Similarly, in Across the Continent on Wings, or Reed Jr.'s Greatest Flight, it features Frank Reed Jr., his father, Pomp, and Barney using individual motorized flying suits to navigate North America. When they reach Utah, they fly above Mormon settlers who initially mistake them for heavenly visitors and bow before them. Frank willingly plays the part, demanding that the faithful bring him an abundance of food and wine. In such episodes, religious superstition is manipulated to get the technocratic hero what he wants, a practice Mark Twain fully investigates over the course of A Connecticut Yankee 5 years later. Throughout that book, Hank Morgan passes off modern technology as magic, primarily because he is afraid the 6th century English citizens will reject his revolutionary program without it. Near the beginning, Morgan uses his knowledge to predict an eclipse, declaring it to be a demonstration of his magical powers. He appeals to the Arthurian superstitions and becomes the boss, a position equal to the king in power. Morgan then puts his skills from the Colt Arms Factory to work, where he tells us, I could make anything a body wanted, and if there wasn't any quick and newfangled way to make a thing, I could invent it. He creates a patent office and a regular newspaper, secretly building telegraphs, telephones, phonographs, and typewriters, along with weapons of war. Morgan's technological shenanigans include using blasting power and lightning to destroy the tower of the court magician Merlin, and gaining prestige by ascribing these pyrotechnics to his superior enchantments. Morgan famously states, when you're going to do a miracle for an ignorant race, play your effects for all they're worth. Now, for years, Twain scholars have debated how much empathy Twain had and how much he expected his audience to have for his Connecticut Yankee. Some think he's approving of Hank Morgan's surreptitious nation-building exercise in Camelot. Others think he's more critical of it. But one thing is clear. By 1900, over a decade after he wrote A Connecticut Yankee, and 2 years after the US had kept the Philippine Islands in the wake of the Spanish-American War, Twain loudly condemned such usurpations of power in foreign lands. In an interview after his round-the-world tour, he noted, "I left these shores at Vancouver a red-hot imperialist. I wanted the American ego to go screaming into the Pacific. It seemed tiresome and tame for it to content itself with the Rockies. Why not spread its wings over the Philippines, I asked myself. And I thought it would be a real good thing to do. But I've thought some more since then, and I have read carefully the Treaty of Paris, and I have seen that we do not intend to free, but to subjugate the people of the Philippines. We have gone there to conquer, not to redeem. And so I am an anti-imperialist. I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land." So here I want to make the claim that there's really a key text between A Connecticut Yankee's ambiguous critique of US imperial impulses and Twain's public coming out as an anti-imperialist in 1900, and it's his neglected masterpiece, Tom Sawyer Abroad. Twain takes his most famous protagonist and makes him the mouthpiece for American exceptionalism, avarice, and conceit. By grafting Tom's naivete to the well-established dime novel template, he subverts the Edisonaide's pro-expansionist themes. He does this throughout the book, but I really want to focus on one scene near the conclusion when Tom and company fly around the Sphinx. Huck, who is our narrator, explains, "We landed Jim on top of the head with the American flag to protect him, it being a foreign land." This is, again, a setup for a scene where they're going to be demeaning to Jim. After sailing away, they returned to find 2 or 3 wee puffs of white smoke below the Sphinx, and men are hauling a long ladder up the Sphinx's back. They realize that Jim is under attack by the locals and that the smoke is gunfire. When they pick him up, Tom Sawyer ignores Jim's understandable fear of bodily harm and instead focuses on the cultural narrative as he sees it. Huck tells us, "Tom was very indignant and asked him why didn't he show the flag and command them to get in the name of the United States. Jim said he done it, but they never paid no attention. Tom said he would have this thing looked into at Washington. And he says, you'll see they'll have to apologize for insulting the flag and pay an indemnity too on top of it, even if they get off that easy." And the italicized "that" there at the end is clearly an implication of military action, which is something he'd see as far worse than reparations. In fact, Lewis Budd, Earl Bryden, and others have noted that the likely inspiration for this scene was an international incident in 1891 between the US and Chile over the mobbing of some American sailors. The Valparaiso incident was a wharfside fight between US Navy seamen and Chilean military personnel that escalated into a mob attack against the American sailors who we are told were not behaving very, very well. American papers reported naval buildups and calls for war, but eventually the matter was settled when Chile paid a $75,000 indemnity. So as with A Connecticut Yankee, we see Twain using a technocratic novel to express his concerns about American exceptionalism. Now, let me see how closely you all have been listening. If this was an international incident, do you think Mark Twain was the first novelist to incorporate it into a technocratic adventure story? Well, I can't hear you. I'm guessing some people are shaking their heads no. Yes, indeed. In March of 1892, just 6 months after the Valparaiso incident, Street and Smith published Tom Edison Jr.'s Chilean Explorer, or The Sea and Air Terror. Contents are much closer to what we'd expect in an Edisonade. The hero has an aircraft that converts into a submarine and he uses it to engage in aerial bombing of the militarizing Chilean fleet. He even joins sailors who are attacked by a Chilean mob, and we're told that these Chilean citizens want a, quote, second edition of the real life attack from October 1891. So in a lot of ways, it's just replaying this historical event from a few months earlier and injecting its technocratic hero into the process. At the story's end, Tom Edison Jr. bombs a torpedo boat and blows his airship's whistle loudly, stating, "It is the scream of the American eagle. Mind you behave yourselves and be good boys, or he will come back and give you a more severe lesson." When we view Tom Sawyer Abroad in contrast with this contemporaneous dime novel, its skepticism and distrust of American technophilia becomes even more apparent. Tom Edison Jr.'s response is brazen jingoism backed by his display of military superiority through technology. Tom Sawyer appears just as cocksure and intelligent, but his adventures are seeped in irony, beckoning readers to question their young white protagonist's authority in a way that dime novel Edisonades did not. When Huck asks if all countries make payments as apologies when they have done wrong, Tom curtly replies, "Yes, the little ones does," and the matter is settled. Tom Sawyer Abroad appropriates the boy inventor story to critique US hubris. So Twain's original contribution to the tradition of boy inventor novels is often, it's not in content, it's in the irony, the voicing of distrust, that perhaps not distrust in technology, but in the Americans who wield it. Now, given Twain's skepticism, I think it's worth talking about how he responded to his era's most famous technology fiction writer, Jules Verne. And for that, I'm going to have to turn to Keokuk, Iowa, of all places, and talk about the, I believe, second most recent thing Twain has published. So we'll talk about Orion Clemens, his brother from Keokuk, and some of the things that led up to Twain publishing his most famous use of Jules Verne in 2001's A Murder, a Mystery, and a Marriage. When this appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, publicity emphasized the novelty of an unknown Twain story seeing print after over a century. Mark Twain returns, the magazine's cover trumpeted. A Murder, a Mystery, and a Marriage juggles several plot points. Bear with me, there's a lot going on in this thing, partly because he wanted to have all three of the elements in it. A Missouri farmer finds a delirious, freezing man lying in the center of a snow-covered field with no footprints around him. The man is nursed back to health, and he speaks many languages while he's delirious. The mysterious stranger alludes that he is Count Fontainebleau, a European noble. He stays with the family and chivalrously admits love for the farmer's daughter, Mary, but he promises not to stand between her and Hugh, her true love. A murder occurs and Hugh is convicted for the crime because the murder weapon is found under his bed. Under these circumstances, Fontainebleau proposes to Mary, and the wedding is scheduled for the exact same day as Hugh's hanging. In the penultimate chapter, it's discovered that Fontainebleau committed the murder for money. He is arrested, Hugh and Mary wed, the murder is solved, the marriage is enacted, and the last chapter solves the mystery of how Fontainebleau appeared in the middle of a snow-covered field. Subtitled The Count's Confession, it is told in first person by Fontainebleau, who is imprisoned and scheduled for execution. He explains that his real name is Jean Mercier, and he is a low-born Frenchman who has worked as a barber, a seaman, and a courier. He tells readers, "At last, in an evil hour, I fell into the hands of Monsieur Jules Verne." Mercier asserts that Verne sent him on all sorts of odd, uncomfortable journeys that Verne then fictionalized into the extraordinary voyage novels that made him famous. "He turned my simple experiences into extravagant and distorted marvels. This humiliated me." For example, Verne ships Mercier down the Seine River in a leaky old sand barge and then embellishes Mercier's notes to create 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. When Verne accompanies him on a balloon voyage, Mercier snaps and throws the author from the balloon to his presumed death. And this picture here is from the artist when this was published in the Atlantic. Mercier floats along to Missouri and at some point passes out, falling into the snowbound farms prairie land. So the mystery is solved. The subsequent murder is just opportunism, although Mercier states that murder comes easy to a man whose mind has been unsettled by torture such as Monsieur Verne had inflicted upon me. Anticipating his own execution, Mercier tells us that he plans to confront Verne when he gets to hell and to learn how many chapters of 18 months in the furnace he has written. Science fiction critic David Ketterer notes Twain has multiple puns about Verne burning in hell, as Mercier imagined that Verne toasts himself in his private apartment down below. Moreover, he says in the last line, I want to know where he lit when he fell after being pushed from the balloon. So again, lit, like he landed, but also lit, as in he's going up in flames. Remember that. This is important. Why would Twain bring the French author so suddenly and negatively into the tale's final moments? The most frequently cited evidence comes from an entry in Twain's notebook from July of 1868. It's a partial draft of the same story's opening, with the farmer finding a man lying in the snow in his field. Then the story stops abruptly. Twain wrote the following handwritten postscript on the first page where the story appears. While this was being written, Jules Verne's 5 Weeks in a Balloon came out, and consequently this sketch wasn't finished. For most Twain scholars, the notebook entry has been enough to explain away the latter novelette's 11th hour incorporation of Jules Verne. Twain drafted a story, had to scuttle it because Verne beat him to the balloon voyage idea, and then reworked the story several years later, even managing to end the story with a dig at Jules Verne. As I researched connections between Twain and Verne, I discovered an interesting related exchange in Twain's correspondence with his brother Orion. And it's spelled like Orion, but they pronounced it with a long O, Orion Clemens. So to finish tonight's look at Twain and science fiction, I want to read a little bit from the book to give you a sense of Twain's correspondence and the kind of things that could come up when two people were talking about the science fiction genre, especially when one was more interested in it than the other person. So the evidence that the things that I'm going to talk about now are going to be quotes from, mostly quotes from letters that are available at the Mark Twain papers at the University of California, Berkeley. So that's where a lot of this comes from. But I want to give you a taste of this. An illuminating example of Twain's understanding of early science fiction can be found in his correspondence with Orion Clemens. Contrary to the then prevailing American familiar standard, Samuel Clemens, rather than his eldest brother, became the de facto head of his extended family. Over the years, he grew increasingly frustrated with Orion's financial and emotional dependence. In 1877, Orion wrote to his famous literary sibling asking him for help constructing and publishing an adventure novel entitled The Kingdom of Sir John Franklin. Orion based his idea on the real-life British explorer who died trying to seek the Northwest Passage. In Orion's fictional tale, Franklin's expedition culminates in a trip to the Earth's core. Orion suggests somewhat sheepishly that he and Sam collaborate in the writing and split the profits of this hollow earth adventure, adding, couldn't you imagine lots of queer adventures and romances under these circumstances? In a letter from February 5th, Orion gives his most clear summary of the entire work in the context of mentioning another problem that has led to revisions. In the part rewritten, there are some curious coincidences with Jules Verne's To the Center of the Earth, though when I wrote my rough draft, I did not know there was such a story. He then goes on for a page and a half in the letter, noting similar plot elements between the two works, such as a broken compass that leads the heroes astray, and similar findings in their respective hollow earths, such as prehistoric dinosaurs. Orion gives details by comparing Verne's story unfavorably to his own. His travelers preposterously go down an extinct volcano. He finds a gorilla 14 feet high, of which he only gives a partial description, and the thing turns out to be a dream. My gorilla is fully described, but is not an ape, as is his. Mine is a gentleman. He is primitive man, with pictures, statues, a daughter who plays music, and a house. From this, we see that Orion conceptualizes his project as incorporating Darwinian ideas of human descent into a fantasy tale of exploration. Orion's letter presents a confluence Sam Clemens couldn't resist, a chance to savage Verne and to dismiss the goals of his clingy older brother. Sam's letters to his mother suggest that he took Orion's claim to have been unaware of Verne with a large grain of salt. He writes, I begin to fear it's going to be only a wandering, objectless, motiveless imitation of the rampaging French lunatic Jules Verne. I saw in the first place that he was walking gaily along exactly in the Frenchman's footsteps, and with the air of a man who wasn't aware there was anything to be ashamed of about it. Orion sends his hero into the interior of the earth. He meets and talks with a very gentlemanly gorilla. He sees and elaborately describes a pterodactyl, etc., etc. Can you imagine a sane man deliberately proposing to retain these things and print them while they already exist in another man's book? In his February 21st reply to Orion, Sam tells him everybody would say the ideas were Verne's and nothing but the expansion and elaboration of them yours. After accusing him of poaching Verne, he seized on the same talking gorilla element that he'd mentioned to the mother and gave his brother the following advice. Why don't you find Verne down there himself? Why don't you handle your gorilla for all he's worth? And when you've got the good of him, let the reader discover it's Verne in disguise. I think the world has suffered so much from that French idiot that they could enjoy seeing him burlesqued, but I doubt they want to see him imitated. It may be fair to say that Orion surprised his brother. Within a week, he wrote back stating that he had written 160 pages. And this is the point where we don't have any further portions of this manuscript. Only about 7 pages actually exist. But we do have Twain's comments on those pages, so we know that Orion finished it. However, Orion's interest has shifted and he has made a major change in his content. He notes the new approach. I shall strike out where I am anticipated by Jules Verne. I find 2 hells in the middle of the earth, one ancient one, the other a modern improvement. I shall put Verne in the last for telling lies and misrepresenting nature. I have been led into that much religion, though I have not been unmindful of your charge to let it alone. The interest of the times, however, in that particular subject, I hope will justify it. Okay, so the 2 things I want to notice here. One is the interest of the times is a provocative phrase, particularly considering the events in Orion's life. Just a year later, after he drafted this story, he was excommunicated from his Presbyterian church by the elders in Keokuk, Iowa. And that was primarily because he voiced doubts over the legitimacy of the scriptures. So in some ways, he's using this science fiction story to work through ideas he later thought about. And he didn't necessarily believe there were 2 hells, but he certainly had doubts about the Bible's truth in the wake of reading Darwin. But the other thing is, of course, Jules Verne in hell. Whose idea was it? If we look at this, it's obvious that Twain wanted Verne to wind up in a gorilla suit in a sort of prehistoric version. The idea of Jules Verne in hell actually comes from Orion Clemens in his letter from 1878, which I think shows us that Twain knew a good idea when he saw one and wasn't above, and I think in this case, probably unconsciously many years later, appropriating it into his novel. So Orion probably deserves a little bit of credit for that idea. But again, I want to make sure everybody understands that there was more than a talking gorilla at stake for Orion Clemens. Like many science fiction authors in the 19th century, he was working through religious doubts and using the technocratic invention tale as a template for doing that. And often that was done in the wake of Darwinian science. And Lou Ahrens did that, Mark Twain did that, many authors did that. That's what I cover in the second half of my book. So if you're interested in that, I'll leave it there. I am happy to take questions about Lucien Aarons, about Jules Verne, about either one of the Clemens brothers, or anything that you all see fit. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nathaniel. We can clap. I don't know if you can hear our applause.
I can feel it. Yes, yes. Thank you.
I can feel the love. I can feel it.
I know. Yes. No. This is we're getting used to this Zoom thing, all of us at the same time, and I do appreciate it.
This has been really marvelous. Certainly for me, I consider myself pretty well read in Twain, and so much of what you had to say was new and important and illuminating. For the benefit of the folklore people, I just want to say that your presentation represents a really tremendous synthesis of pop culture, literary studies, and folkloristics. The overarching dynamic that I would want hearers of your talk to be aware of is you're talking about a place in literature where the culture talks to itself, about itself, in coded ways, about its own anxieties, about stuff that they're kind of not allowed to say out loud. And that's kind of the meeting spot of folkloristics, your particular kind of literary studies, and popular culture. One of the things that happens in folklore is we don't know where to draw that bright line between pop culture and folklore. And in fact, I prefer to keep fogging it. And that's what you're doing for us tonight. And I thank you so much. We're wrapping up the folklore course. We're wrapping up the colloquium. And we couldn't have made a better choice of a way to wrap it up or a person to wrap it up. So thank you.
Thank you.
And we will entertain questions now. You can unmute yourselves. Do we have folks who want to ask questions?
Well, sure. So thank you for that presentation. I just attended the Zoom version of this year's Pop Culture Association conference. And were you in attendance as well?
I was not, but they've had a very active dime novel subgroup
Yes,
for a while.
yeah.
I know several of the members there. They've done great work.
Yeah, and dime novels have not been my area of particular interest, but I'm a big, I have a lot of interest in Twain, and I had not realized the way in which those two spheres of writing have intersected. I was thinking about another intersection. When I read Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court and have read it with students, I've talked about it as illustrating transitions between three major literary movements. It starts as if it's going to be a romantic story. It's got all the characteristics of early 19th century romanticism, especially that Camelot setting.
Mhm.
And it looks as if it's going to be optimistic and upbeat, and all will be rosy. And then it moves to what I see as realism when the Yankee starts introducing American advertising and American technology, and it becomes gritty. But that last scene that you talked about is one of the most, it's one of the bleakest in literature, I think. The Yankee and his friends are trapped in a cave with all those armaments that you mentioned, all those traps for the is it 30,000 knights who are going to attack. And what's coming is absolutely unstoppable. And that's where it becomes, for me, literary naturalism. The forces are they're beyond resistance.
Mhm.
And so I had that in mind, but I was also thinking about these these young men inventors who are able to surmount any kind of obstacle in the dime novels, and putting those against other examples of naturalism at the time. So we've got Frank Norris's To Light a Fire, where not only does the hero not have any kind of technology, he has ignored the accumulated knowledge of his culture. We've got Stephen Crane at the same time with, with characters who similarly are at the mercy of the elements, and they don't have the technological or mental skills to combat them. So that's where my thinking has been taking me this evening.
Yeah, no, I like that. It's great. You mentioned the naturalist, Crane's Blue Hotel.
Yes.
Where the violence could be blamed on dime novels, or at least the perception, right? There's this idea that Easterners are eating these dime novels up.
Yes.
And then going out West expecting it to be like that.
Yes.
Sensationalized thing. And in some ways that misunderstanding causes them to behave in ways that facilitate frontier violence.
Yes.
So I think that the naturalists were keyed in on this kind of thing.
And then that goes back to Twain too, Nathaniel, with his stories in Roughing It, where he talks about himself as this naive kid coming from Missouri. It's not the East Coast, and he trusts what he's read in books. When he's lost in the snow, he thinks his horse will give his horse his head because he's read that in books, and so that's taking up that same idea that you're talking about.
Yeah. So and that sort of urge, I think that both realism and naturalism have to mock book learning as the solution, which is not and this is where it gets tricky. The dime novels don't value book smarts. They value the ability to seize an opportunity and make stuff happen. It's a very different kind of learning than maybe the people that Crane is mocking, right? But I'm trying to kind of tie that to Twain in some ways.
Well,
go ahead.
I'm suddenly getting a flash on one of Clint Eastwood's real supreme achievements, the film Unforgiven, and the character of English Bob. If anybody remembers that, he was sort of inventing himself as a dime novel hero, and there was such supreme awareness of media as media, and of fictionalizing gritty events, romanticizing them for immediate consumption without editorial processing. And yeah, I'm just seeing a continuity between what Twain is doing with Verne and what Eastwood does with English Bob.
Yes, absolutely. I that's something I'm really fascinated by in researching these dime novels, because when you think about the life of a dime novelist, they're just producing by the word every day. You're basically sitting down and writing a novella-length piece of fiction every day. And so they used, what we called in journalism a morgue, right? They just would have lists of stories. And what I found, not in doing science fiction, but in researching detective novels, if there was a bank robbery in Detroit, Michigan, about 3 months later, there would be a dime novel that would have a bank robbery in Detroit, Michigan, and they would have the hero meet with the actual chief of police, who would be named, and they might go to a tavern that was actually a tavern in that area. I mean, they really were trying to do this sort of realistic reporting to get the ideas out there. So it's not surprising that one of the most famous early Frank Reed stories is Frank Reed and his steam locomotive against the James Boys, right? Jesse James is another one of those Missouri figures who comes into this and is portrayed heroically in some and as a villain in others. But that's exactly the kind of thing that I think that English Bob character is about. And actually, is to speak of another film Western, if you've seen the movie The Assassination of Jesse James with Brad Pitt and Casey Affleck. And Casey Affleck's character, as Bob Ford tells him, "I read all about you in the Wide Awake Library." I mean, he feels like he knows this guy because he's read the fiction about him, which I think, as the movie points out, is a very modern problem too. You know, I follow you on Twitter.
It's also a play on the opening of Huckleberry Finn.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because
you don't know
Tom,
me. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But that you read this book.
Yeah.
And that Tom, throughout that book, is going to be taking stories that he's read and trying to force them to be enacted by all these people, up to, again, the problematic end of rescuing Jim when he's already freed, because that's how the Count of Monte Cristo would have it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
More questions? Are there some of our students who'd like to ask questions?
I'll point out while people are thinking, I'm happy to answer questions about fiction writing, editing, book review editing for the Mark Twain Annual, which I do. I mean, if you have any questions about just that kind of stuff, if you want to know what Kirksville was like in the mid 90s, I can answer that stuff too. Not that anybody needs to know it.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
You spoke briefly about the dime novels that would get so ridiculous that many scholars view them as like parody. If you had gone to a store and purchased one of those at the time, how aware were the consumers that it was like? How aware were they that it was a parody, or did they see it kind of as just as legitimate, or just reaching the next level? Because I'm a comic book buyer, and I often go into the store and see the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen, and I'm like, I don't know if I'm going into this and going to laugh or going to like actually be along for the ride. And I'm curious how that kind of translates.
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head as far as that problem. We don't really know. And of course, if you're a publisher, you want to have it both ways, right? Your ideal is to have maybe an adult audience that consumes this ironically, and maybe a kid audience who just thinks having a giant mechanical ostrich that shoots people is a great idea. And that's it. And that's what they're trying to accomplish. I think of like the old Batman TV show in the 60s, speaking of comic books, right? That's kind of the classic example of, mom and dad watch it because it's all these old actors and completely over the top stuff, and it's in color. And kids could watch it and enjoy it unironically. So I can I say for sure? No, but I would guess there were a lot of people buying Electric Bob's over the top stories and enjoying them completely unironically without any sense that they were perhaps parodies of the form. And that's something that we see going on throughout the history of children's entertainment and what becomes superheroes and that kind of thing. So
yeah, that definitely makes sense. I am curious from that perspective then, do we know much about like what the author thought? Did he feel like he was writing like cheesy schlock, or did he like fully behind it?
Right. Well, okay, so I've got two answers there. One, Lucid Aarons, who was the guy that wrote most of the kind of unironic ones, really was really dismissive of the stuff that he wrote when people came back to interview him in the 1920s and 30s. And when Hugo Gernsback put that label of American Jules Verne on him, he had done a couple of profiles, and every time he said he was kind of embarrassed of just the kind of fantastical ideas. But he would often go to the great refuge of so many science fiction writers and say, but then some of the stuff came true. There are submarines, there are battleships, I mean, it was so he saw it as kind of an embarrassing job he was doing just to make money. And if some of the things that he predicted, his approach was kind of a stop clock, gets the time right twice a day. And he may have predicted a couple of things, but it was just a job for him. So that's one answer. The other answer is that, and you probably noticed this in the presentation, a lot of these authors are buried under pseudonyms or under corporate authorship. Sometimes, for example, with the Tom Edison Jr., I've read maybe 4 of these, and at least 2 of them have to have been written by completely different people, right? One is written in long paragraph form. The other is sort of this telegraphies. It's as if one's written by Faulkner and the other's by Hemingway, right? You just would know by the style, these are not the same author. They're both ascribed to the same author because they were owned by Street and Smith, and they were going to put that pseudonym on anything that had that character's name. So long-winded answer to say, we don't know what some of these people thought. In fact, a lot of the research is still figuring out who wrote what and which author did it, and maybe which editor encouraged that. There are apocryphal stories of dime novel publishers, taking all their letters that had been sent to them from readers and burning them in the winter in the stove to stay warm, and taking all their receipts and doing the same thing if it had been a couple of years. I mean, so a lot of the collected assemblage of things, the kind of letters that I get to look at that Orion and Sam Clemens had, that just doesn't exist for dime novels. There was no sense that these are famous, important people whose body of work we need to maintain. Okay, so hopefully those two examples kind of make sense and answer what, or get to what you're asking.
Yeah, I understand.
It's a great question.
I kind of understand. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I see another hand up. Grace?
Yeah, hi. This is not necessarily my main area of expertise. I do history scholarship more often than not, but every now and again, I stumble my way into researching pulp novels. And you mentioned Lucenarians a few times. I do a lot of work with Latin American history. Okay. And I'm really, really interested because you mentioned how Lucenarians, being a first generation Cuban American immigrant, it kind of complicates a lot of the output that he has. One of the really wild experiences I have with pulp novels is this is so niche, but there's a series called The Man from Pansy Division, and it's a very odd pulp novel, and it was written by the same guy who helped create Daredevil and was like operating in a very interesting space because he was like operating in like the comic book space, which was shared with like a lot of like really weird artists who were also like operating in some very deviant, shall we say, spaces of like sexuality magazines at the time. And that complicates a lot of what I've encountered in researching that specific pulp novel series specifically. Like, is that like just like an ongoing theme of people in like this like mass produced media object industry, or is that just, or am I just stumbling into weirdos all the time?
Well, I think let me make sure I kind of getting to your point, which is that some of these people are injecting things that they want to satirize or that they want to celebrate into the template of, I've got to turn in a 40,000 word story about a submarine. But you know what I'm going to do is I see that a lot. I certainly see that in Sanarin's work after, and this is what I go into in the book. There were at least 5 boy adventure stories with Frank Reed and Jack Wright where they went to Cuba and helped the Cubans fight Spain. And they would unequivocally say, we support the Cubans because they're just like the Americans were in the Revolutionary War. These men are Washingtons and Hamiltons and Jeffersons, and we need to support them and support their sovereignty, right? Which I'm sure, as you know, at that point, most of the periodicals and most of the war fiction that was coming out there was supporting the annexation of Cuba, right? They wanted to completely take Cuba's sovereignty away and just, basically replace Spain with the United States. And Sanarin's was fighting that fight in the same way. I mean, for the comic book fans, in the same way that a lot of those Jewish comic book artists decided, hey, let's put Hitler on the cover and have Captain America punch him. Sanarin's is doing the same thing with these Spanish generals that he's hearing are torturing people and forcing confessions out of people to the Cuban insurgents. Even including he has fictionalized portrayals of the Spanish General Vilar and of multiple Cuban generals in his story. So that's what I see in Sanarin's work that kind of explains that. But I think you're right. If you examine anybody who's getting paid by the word or getting paid to produce more than having time to sit back and reflect, especially if they're writing formula fiction, right? Especially if they've just like, all they have to do is write a story about X. They're going to find some way to take the thing they're interested in and get that into it, partly just as a survival mechanism. So those are my thoughts.
Where does H. Rider Haggard fit in all this?
H. Rider Haggard is one of the people that Twain does borrow liberally from. So we know that the scene where he predicts the eclipse is from Rider Haggard.
Ah.
And the writer, the scholar Bruce Michelson actually has a great book. It's called Printer's Devil, and he actually does an entire thing where he looks at the influence of she and King Solomon's mines on a Connecticut Yankee specifically. The other thing that we have is, because Mark Twain became famous, married into a wealthy family, and kept a pretty good library, we have people who have been really cataloging what his reading process was and what he read since before he passed away. And so we know he read Haggard. I can't find evidence that he read the dime novels, but it's kind of like trying to prove that somebody read, if somebody read the Harry Potter novel today, that's a little harder than proving that they read, say, something that was a bestseller and that they talked about and wrote about. And it's even harder with dime novels, because that's almost like saying, did they read this particular issue of Time magazine from 1996 that had this article in it? I mean, this is not something that was kept in his library. They probably read it, pitched it, and we don't have any evidence that it was read unless the person brings it up. So, but yeah, Rider Haggard, I think his influence is profound, just in adventure fiction, and he's one of the people that you continue to see imitated by Americans. I mean, really up to, well, I dealt with some Lost Race novels that were in the early 1910s, and Rider Haggard is all over those too.
Well, they're still doing films, and he was published in Harper's Weekly, so he would have been available to a wide American audience.
Right. And interestingly, Jules Verne, some of his publications were in the American translations. One, they were badly translated. The American translators often, or not American translators, the British translators who were doing Verne often cut 20-30% of Verne out. But his publisher wanted them to be accessible to families. And so he was published in places that were I think, to Americanize, were juvenile markets, or potentially juvenile markets, which is one reason why Verne sort of has that taint of genre author kid stuff that Rider Haggard does not, even though they're mining pretty similar, they're drawing from pretty similar wells. So at least that's my take on it, as a person who is neither a Francophone scholar nor a British scholar. But I am in the process of doing an article right now about Verne in US translations. A lot of people don't know, Jules Verne has a scene in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea where we find out that Captain Nemo has a picture drawn by Victor Hugo of John Brown, the American abolitionist, hanging. Right, that's one of his. It's Captain Nemo is a John Brown fangirl. Wow. Right, this is one of his heroes. He loves this guy, and it's in there. And it's like, wow. Of course, they kept that out of the American editions. Nobody, but the French realized that was going on. But then when you look at that, you realize, oh yeah, Captain Nemo's whole thing is he is against. He is for self-determination, and he's supporting all these people who are having revolutions, because he also idolizes Lincoln, and he idolizes all these Italian and Polish freedom fighters. But then to include Brown there, it's like, but it's not just trying to form a nation state. It's actually
No.
more about the freedom of the individual. And that's a pretty loud message that was neglected for years because it wasn't included in the translations.
Well,
And that's the thing. You can tell I enjoy this stuff. So many of these things, if you scratch the surface, you start to realize there's a lot of really complicated things going on. And maybe I think it's been unspoken to this point, but when you deal with these, or you deal with comic books or anything like that, you are dealing with art and literature that some people can easily dismiss or traditionally have easily dismissed and haven't thought that they were worth the time and examination. And what I just find again and again is there's a lot there.
And this is exactly why we're in folklore.
Yes.
Because we look at the things that people don't take seriously, and perhaps even the producers of them did not take seriously, and we're not consciously intending what we find they quite obviously intended. Nathaniel, I thank you so very much. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for sharing your expertise, for taking us on a wide-ranging journey.
Thank you. I've had a great time. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And if you were actually coming home to Kirksville, we'd all be going out for a drink now.
Oh, good. Good.
Well, I'll owe you one.
I'll hoist one and think of you.
Okay. Okay. Friends, thank you so much for attending. And I wish you well. Have a good evening. Good luck in your exams. And I'll see you virtually again Friday morning. So,
thank you. Thank you, Nathaniel.
Thank you. Appreciate
thank you.
it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm-
Actually, Dr. Davis, I did have a quick question, actually.
Certainly.
Are you going to be in your office on Friday? I have some questions about my folklore draft I want to ask you.
We can do them by email or by Zoom. I'm not intending on being physically in my office. I can if it's necessary.
Okay, cool. I'll email you sometime, hopefully tonight. I had a few questions about my draft I wanted to ask you about. Thank you
Okay,
so much.
great.
Thank you for the talk.
Okay.
Thank you.
Nate, I'll say goodbye now. It's
Okay.
so good to see you.
Oh, it's great to see you. Yes,
Just a
yes, long
handshake.
distance handshake. I can tell just from the conversation and question that it's a busy time at Truman right now, isn't it? Is this the week before finals?
Right. We are
Okay.
2 days before finals begin, and of course, some people have already begun their finals. How about at your end?
Oh, well, we're on the quarter system, so we're actually midterms right
Oh,
now.
okay. Okay.
So I've got big papers coming in my science writing class. I'll have about 48 lit reviews to read, but it's fun. I enjoy it, and I learn a lot.
Yeah. I love
Part of it.
I love science writing. I never taught a science writing course, but you worked with me in the tech
Oh,
writing
yeah.
course so many years ago, and
Absolutely.
that's what I always loved about that course is just learning so much from these students who actually know stuff I don't know.
Right.
That's the hidden joy of teaching tech writing is you don't deal with content at all. You're just dealing with writing and communication. And I'm kind of the ideal audience for them because I don't know anything. They have the duty to communicate clearly to me.
Right. Yeah. And they will rarely have somebody who's that receptive. I tell you, if you're writing online help, they're already in a bad mood if they had to fire it up and access it, right? I mean, so if you think I'm tough, just wait, buddy.
Right. I'm the nice guy.
Right.
Nate, be well.
Great to see you.
Good to see you. Ciao.
Thank you, Adam. I appreciate you putting this together. All right, we'll see you. Take care.